When Sam Herr met up with Daniel Wozniak on May 21, 2010, he had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. After all, he'd been living in the same apartment complex as Dan for a while by then and had come to know him as a decent, if little intense guy. It seemed that a stressed out and intense demeanor was to be expected from a struggling actor who was getting married in a few days. What Sam didn't know, however, was just how much stress Dan was under. That said, ever the good friend, he was only too happy to help once Dan said he needed a favor. Unfortunately, though, that would be the last time Sam ever carried out a good deed, as by the time the day was over, he'd be dead, with his hands and his head removed. And that wouldn't be the only murder Daniel Wozniak would commit over the coming days either. No, it would only be the beginning. This is Monsters. Sam Herr was born on May 29, 1983 into a pretty typical middle-class Jewish family, so as you'd expect, his childhood was pretty good. After all, both his parents, Steve and Raquel, doted on him at every opportunity they could, and that led to the youngster developing into a kind and caring young man, someone who was pretty universally popular with his schoolmates. He would develop a spark of rebellion once he reached his teen years, as most children that age do. But he wasn't one to cause any trouble while he was at home. Of course, things did change for a little while when he found himself becoming friends with a few kids who were gang-affiliated in the local Los Angeles area. That was the point that Sam's life almost took a dark turn when one of those friends, Byron Benito, was stabbed to death during a turf war in Santa Clarita in January of 2002. Sure, Sam wouldn't directly be responsible for that death, but he was accused at the time of being indirectly involved by helping Byron to lure an enemy to the location where that fateful fight happened. For that reason, he was arrested and would spend the better part of a year sitting in a jail cell before he was finally acquitted of any wrongdoing. Needless to say, that had quite an emotional impact on the 18-year-old. In fact, at one point while in jail, he even entertained thoughts of suicide. So once he was finally released and given a second lease on life, he chose to take advantage of it and try to rebuild his life. After spending a period of time working odd jobs here and there at a delivery service, security company, and pet groomers, he joined the U.S. Army as he thought it would not only give him some much-needed stability, but also scratch a growing itch he had for adventure. His mother, Raquel, was unsure about that decision initially, worrying about what might happen to her son if he was sent to a war zone. Sam's father, Steve, on the other hand, was overjoyed to hear about his boy's decision. The reason for that was because he was a former military man himself, a U.S. Marine to be precise. That would end up bringing the two closer together than they ever had been before. Their relationship from that point onwards made them seem more like a younger brother, older brother than a father-son. Still, even if he was happy his only child was following in his footsteps, Steve had to be a little concerned about what awaited Sam over the next couple of years, particularly as he was destined to be stationed in Afghanistan right when that conflict was at its peak. But if he did harbor any secret worries, he needn't have because, as it happened, Sam's overseas life went pretty well. He spent more time playing the role of protective big brother to his vulnerable female colleagues than dodging enemy fire. Ever the naturally caring person, Sam was quick to realize once he arrived in Afghanistan that female soldiers often had a tough time. It wasn't just them who could struggle with daily life there either. No, it was also LGBTQ members of the military too. So upon seeing that, he made it his mission to always make sure those members of his team were looked after. As one of his closest friends in the Army, Teresa Glowicki, would later say, quote, "He looked out for me like I was his little sister." Of course, that isn't to say Sam wasn't willing to throw himself right into the fray whenever the opportunity arose. He had usually been the first person to volunteer whenever a dangerous mission came along. That meant that after 15 months of serving in Afghanistan, he was moved over to Europe where he finished out his service in far more peaceful locations, something that allowed him to enjoy more of a party lifestyle for a while. It was during one of those nights of partying that he met Katerina, a young German woman who he quickly fell in love with. Once he was shipped back over to the US in May of 2009 and returned to civilian life, he arranged for her to come over and visit him on multiple occasions, with them even going as far as to start discussing plans for marriage at one point. But things were not all great for Sam as the new decade dawned. Even if his experiences in Afghanistan had been largely positive, he had still seen enough over there that he was left with PTSD, something which primarily presented itself for him in the form of night terrors. At a certain point, he tried to move forward with his life, leaving his parents' home once more and moving to the Camden Martinique apartment complex in Costa Mesa, California. Not that he wouldn't remain close with his folks after that, though. No, he'd still see a lot of them, particularly his father, who he remained very good friends with. But he was also making new friends at Camden Martinique, one of whom was a local actor named Daniel Wozniak. Daniel Wozniak was born on March 24, 1984, only a year after Sam, and like Sam, he had a pretty standard middle-class upbringing. Born and raised in Orange County, he had attended Los Alamitos High School, and there he discovered a passion for performance. Obviously, that led him to becoming heavily involved in both school choir and theater class, with it being in the latter that he truly shone and gained both the love and respect of his peers. As one old classmate, Allison Hathcock, would later describe Dan during her time studying together, quote, "Everyone knew him, everyone liked him." Unsurprisingly then, after graduating, Dan set his sights on becoming a professional actor, something he did by seeking out work everywhere he could in his local community. He worked hard to try to build up a name for himself in the theater scene. Sure, he could have ventured over to nearby Hollywood and tried out his hand in the movies instead, but something about the stage called out to the young man. That was why he instead chose to remain in Orange County, where he would split his time between studying drama at California State University and performing at hot spots like the Liberty Theater, a community theater located at a military training base in Los Alamitos. This may not come as a surprise to some of you, but theater acting jobs for a fresh face in the business aren't known for being well-paying. In order to keep his head above water, Dan also had to work a lot of sales jobs, something he was good at on account of his outgoing and charming personality. But in the end, those jobs would usually be short-lived, more often than not ending with him being fired when accusations of theft came up. To be fair, no charges would ever officially be brought against him any of those times, but the repeated pattern surely suggests Dan was far from innocent. It seemed that even back then he was willing to go to drastic measures in order to get some money if he felt he needed it. Of course, he wasn't the only one who was struggling financially back in the late 2000s. No, many of the young people living at the Camden Martinique apartment complex were in a similar situation. One of the few who was not in bad shape financially, though, was Sam Herr. As a result of his time in the military, he'd been able to accrue around $62,000 in combat pay. That meant that, not having to worry about making ends meet for the immediate future, he could instead focus on doing what he really wanted to: start a career in political science. That was what led him to start studying at Orange Coast College, working towards a degree in that subject. There, he threw himself into his education with all the gusto he had during his time in the military. And it was also during that time that he first met Juri Kibuishi. Juri Kibuishi, or Julie as she was known to her friends, was a few years younger than Sam, having been born on February 14, 1986. But that didn't make them any less close. After they first became introduced once she started tutoring him in anthropology, it didn't take long for them to become like brother and sister. But then that was something that often happened whenever Sam made a new friend, particularly a woman. His protective side came out and he began acting like more of a sibling than anything else. Julie certainly appreciated having a buddy like Sam around, as life could be pretty stressful for her too on account of her studying fashion at Orange Coast College, all while she was trying to live up to the high expectations of her Japanese immigrant parents. She was the youngest of 4 siblings, and so they demanded a lot from her, just as they had her brothers and sisters. While she was studying fashion in the hopes it would lead to a good backup career, her real-life passion was dancing, and her real goal was to do it on a professional basis. Obviously, that meant she was very active within the local dance scene in Orange County, particularly in ballet, which she attended classes for multiple times a week. When she wasn't doing that, she was talking online with her boyfriend Mark Johnson, himself a military man, more specifically a Marine corporal based in Okinawa, Japan. The pair had never met in real life yet on account of them being separated by the Pacific Ocean, but that didn't mean Julie wasn't smitten with him, something she was always happy to tell Sam all about whenever they were hanging out together. In fact, by the time 2010 came around, Julie and Mark were already making plans to meet up once he returned stateside later that year. Tragically, though, that would never happen, because before it could, she would be brutally murdered by someone she would never have in a million years suspected: Daniel Wozniak. Given how close she was to Sam and how much time she spent at his apartment helping him study, it was inevitable that Julie was eventually going to be introduced to Dan. Not only Dan, but also his fiancée, Rachel Mae Buffett. Rachel was by that point living with Dan at the Camden Martinique apartment complex, with her also being a local actor, often appearing in the same productions as Dan did. Unlike Dan, though, who was now starting to gain something of a reputation as quite a talent within the local scene, something he proved with his performances in productions such as The Music Man, where his intense method acting style was praised by everyone who saw it, Rachel was not breaking out in quite the same way. No, the most notable work she'd done come 2010 was playing the part of the Little Mermaid at Disneyland. That, understandably, did not make it easy for her to fund her expensive tastes in life. Even the wedding she and Dan had been planning was proving to be a big stress on them financially, something Dan was not shy about talking about whenever the opportunity arose. The stress that was causing on their relationship was only worsened by the fact that each appeared to have an issue with the other's parents. For Dan, the reason he wasn't too fond of Rachel's folks was because, as a deeply conservative Christian couple, he felt they never truly approved of his more freewheeling way of life, as well as the accusations of criminal activity which had dogged him throughout his adulthood. Meanwhile, Rachel had immediately taken a dislike to Dan's parents to the point that around 6 months before the wedding was due to take place, she convinced Dan to cut off all contact with them. Of course, many have speculated in the years since that the only reason Rachel had gone down that path was because she wanted to control her partner emotionally, and like any good abuser, she knew that the best way to do that was to cut him off from all his other support networks. Whether that was true or not, however, is up for debate. All that is known for sure is that in the months leading up to their wedding, Dan cut off all contact with his family, though not before he made one final visit to his parents' home in Long Beach to steal his father's .38 caliber handgun. While it's not known exactly why he decided to take the gun at that point, it's been speculated that he was intending to pawn it off in order to get some money to help him pay for his increasingly expensive wedding. But he never ended up pawning the weapon. For one reason or another, he chose to keep it in his possession. That would prove to be a very fateful move, as it would later be a fatal factor in what happened to Sam and Julie. Before those grisly murders occurred, though, Dan was on good terms with the pair, or at least he was on good terms with Sam, with the two often hanging around each other at their apartment complex. Sam, ever the good friend, tried his best to make his new buddy feel better about his financial woes. Not everyone was a fan of Dan, though. Some friends of Sam's who had been introduced to him through the former soldier had a very different impression of the up-and-coming actor. In fact, one of those friends would go as far as to outright tell his old buddy that he didn't like the new associate of his. Then there were the people who'd already known Dan for years by then. Many of them saw the changes that were taking place in their old friend as he had prepared for marriage and didn't like what he was turning into. As Jeff Hathcock, owner of the Liberty Theater Dan performed at, would put it himself, quote, He had markedly changed from the last time I saw him. He was hesitant. He was more reticent to be a jolly fellow. You could tell it was because of Rachel. He used to be the one leading the group in. Now she went ahead and he walked behind. Was it the pressure of trying to impress Rachel and give her both the life and the wedding she wanted that caused Dan to do what he did next? Many have certainly speculated that's the case. After all, he did noticeably seem to perk up once. While hanging out with Sam one night, he learned that he had a fair amount of money put away from his time in the military. Not just that, but he'd also been in trouble with the law before on account of an accusation of him being an accessory to murder. Really then, if anything was to ever happen to someone close to Sam, it should be easy for the authorities to believe he'd been the one responsible for it. And just like that, a plan began to formulate in the young actor's mind. As to when that plan would become real action, well, that would happen on May 21st, 2010, a Friday. As Rachel would later tell it, on that morning, her fiance's mood had been noticeably off. Now, rather than being relatively calm, if a little stressed out, he seemed to have something serious on his mind, almost as if he'd come to a terrible decision about something over the course of the evening prior. At that point, Rachel claimed she asked him what was wrong, but Dan wouldn't tell her. He only said that he had to go meet Sam at his apartment and would be back soon. As to what happened after that, well, as Rachel would explain to the police when questioned a few days later, Dan returned a short while later with Sam and another mystery man in tow. Once they were all together, Dan would once again start telling his friend about his money woes. Obviously then, being the good friend he was, Sam would try to offer solutions in any way he could, with him at one point suggesting that the struggling actor join the military as it would be a good way for him to earn a nice little nest egg. When that didn't work, the former soldier even offered to lend his friend some money so that he could keep his head above water. What Sam didn't know, though, was that Dan had already borrowed some money from someone a few weeks prior. $3,000, in fact, from another friend named Chris Williams. It was on that very Friday afternoon that Chris was due to show up at Dan's apartment to be repaid. When Chris did show up, he wouldn't find his buddy waiting there with his money. Rather, he stumbled upon the scene of Dan spilling his guts to Sam, and pretty quickly after that, Dan and Sam made their exit, leaving Chris alone with Rachel. Dan wouldn't say where they were going, but Chris assumed he was going to get him some of the money he owed him. So he hung around for a while, and a few hours later, Dan returned alone and handed him a stack of cash. It wasn't the full amount he was owed, but given how flustered his friend seemed, Chris didn't want to push the matter any further at the moment. He thought it was best to just leave and come back another time. After all, there appeared to be a lot of tension between the soon-to-be married couple all of a sudden, and he didn't want to get in the middle of all that. So he said his goodbyes and left, blissfully unaware of the situation he just accidentally stumbled into. It was a lucky escape in many ways, because had Dan been given any reason to suspect Chris thought something was wrong, it could have ended very badly for him. It would be later that Chris learned just how close he had been to becoming a possible victim. One person who would not be able to get away so easily, though, would be Julie. Dan's plan involved her being murdered and framing Sam. Once her body was discovered the following day, no one knew she was the second victim of Daniel yet. In fact, no one even suspected Dan had anything to do with what had happened to her. At that moment, all of the suspicion fell on Sam, who had been conspicuous by his absence over the prior 24 hours and who everyone assumed was still alive. The reason suspicion fell on Sam was because of the way Julie's body was found. Basically, Sam's father, Steve, had grown concerned about the fact his son hadn't gotten in touch with him for over a day. That was unusual given how close the young man was to his father, and especially unusual as he was supposed to be visiting them for the weekend. So at that point, he decided to head over to Sam's apartment, but what he found there was not his son. Instead, he found the dead body of Julie, her body bent over Sam's bed with her jeans torn and pulled down below her knees, and the words, quote, "all yours, fuck you," clearly written across her back in black marker. Right then, it would have made sense for Steve to get out of there immediately and call the authorities, but now in a state of shock, he continued to look for his son. It was while doing that he noticed a bullet wound in the side of Julie's head, something that finally snapped him back to reality and made him realize something truly terrible had happened. So it was at around 9 p.m. that evening, local police received a call from him saying that he'd found a dead body inside his son's apartment.
Okay, what's going on, sir?
There's a body in my son's apartment.
There's a what?
A body, a dead body.
A dead body? Are you sure, sir?
I can think he's cold, man, I'm sure.
Okay.
He's cold.
Okay, hold on just a minute. Is it someone that you know, sir?
I have no idea who she is. I don't know what's going on.
Does your son know who it is?
He's not here. Jesus, honey.
Okay. Do you know where your son is?
No, I don't. I told you. Phone off.
Okay. Just keep breathing for me, sir, okay? Where in the apartment is she?
She's in the bedroom. She's got this with some sexual activity. She's dead. There's blood from her head. I thought she was thinking she was cold.
There was blood from her head?
Yeah. Honey, I don't know what to say.
Okay, just stay in there, okay?
I fear Jesus.
It is, but is it clear it is?
Hello?
I'm still here, sir. I'm not going to hang up, okay? Until there's someone there with you.
As to where Sam was, well, he had no idea. That meant the young man immediately became the prime suspect in the case, particularly after the cops took a look at Julie's phone. The phone was still on her person when she was found, and investigators delved into her recent text message history. As those messages would show, at some point that evening, the young dancer had been contacted by Sam, or someone using Sam's phone at least, to ask her to drive over to his apartment and meet with him. As the messages explained, Sam had some family issues going on, major enough that he needed a shoulder to cry on. Curiously, though, over the course of the series of messages, he made sure to specify that he wasn't asking Julie for sex, something Julie may have been puzzled by because the two never had that kind of relationship. Their relationship had always been platonic and both had partners of their own, something Sam was well aware of. So why he would feel the need to add such a caveat would probably ring a little strange with her. But at the time she brushed it off, presumably putting it down to him being in a bad state of mind and not thinking straight. Sensing her friend needed her, she left her brother who she was having dinner with and headed over to his apartment. The last contact she made with anyone was when she texted her older sibling upon arrival at the apartment complex to tell him she was at Sam's door and she could hear crying on the other side, so she was probably going to be there for a while. The next day, she would be found dead in that same apartment by Steve. That was when the hunt for Sam started moving fast, not just on the police's part, but also on Steve's, as he felt instinctively that there had to be more to the story. After all, knowing his son and the relationship he had with Julie, he just couldn't bring himself to believe he could have done something so heinous to her. So he began a side investigation of his own, one that would soon lead him to the door of Daniel Wozniak, someone who had spent a lot of time with Sam in the weeks prior to his disappearance. But while Steve might have hoped that meeting would give him some concrete answers as to where his boy was and whether or not he truly had killed Julie, in the end it only raised more questions. That was because over the course of the conversation the two had, it became very clear to Steve that Dan was lying to him, or at the very least was not telling the whole truth. Sure, he would admit to having seen Sam in the morning prior to his disappearance, but something about the way he tried to claim Sam had only come to him to discuss family problems rang untrue. Steve knew all too well that not only were he and his wife on very good terms with their son, but their son was still very much in love with his girlfriend over in Germany. In fact, he had told them as much just days prior. No, there was definitely something off about the way the actor was carrying himself. It was almost as if he was trying to plant a seed in the head of Sam's father that could later be used to explain why he would have killed Julie so easily. Then there was the fact that a number of withdrawals had been made from Sam's bank account in the days since his disappearance. When Steve brought that up, the reaction from Dan had been odd, like he knew more than he was letting on. At that point, Steve's suspicions were raised, so he contacted the police and advised them they should look into Dan. The police proceeded to do so, if for no other reason than they thought it might help bring them closer to tracking down their lead suspect. When they did bring Dan in for more questioning, though, they found themselves suddenly agreeing that there was more to this story than had initially been apparent. For one thing, all throughout that first interview, Dan was notably nervous, even shaking. While that in itself didn't mean he'd done anything wrong, when he told them a story about Sam coming to their apartment with a mystery man in tow and offering to give him and his fiance money, their alarm bells started ringing. By that point, they'd already spoken to Chris Williams, the man Dan had given a handful of cash to later that day, and he said that, on May 21st, there was no mystery man present at the apartment. It was himself, Sam, Dan, and Rachel. When Rachel backed up Dan's claim of a mystery man, investigators smelled a cover-up. The next question they asked was why the couple would lie about such a key detail. Sure, they could have been telling the truth and Chris could have been the one lying, but the fact no one else had ever seen the other man with Sam at any prior time led them to think that probably wasn't the case. There was obviously something the soon-to-be married couple weren't telling the investigators. The suspicions surrounding them would be confirmed soon thereafter when detectives were able to track down fraudulent usage of Sam's credit card to a 16-year-old boy named Wesley Freilich. As to who Wesley Freilich was and how he came into possession of Sam's credit card, as he explained it once authorities showed up at his door, he was an aspiring young actor who had found something of an idol in Dan. That had led to the pair growing friendly whenever they worked together at the Liberty Theater. So when Dan had taken Sam's credit card from his body after murdering him on May 21st, he subsequently handed it over to Wesley for safekeeping. That had been the beginning of the next step in his plan to shift blame away from himself. Not that Wesley knew anything untoward had been going on at that time, however. As far as he understood the situation, his idol Dan was simply working for a bail bondsman on the side, and that credit card belonged to a client who had recently posted bail. Of course, to most people that would be an extremely suspicious story, and it might have seemed a little fishier that Dan kept returning and giving the young man wads of cash to store away every day following that, but he was a kid who was starstruck. So from his perspective, it's not hard to see why he bought it. Where he screwed up, though, was using the credit card to order pizza, something that allowed investigators to track him down. Now that they knew Dan was the one who'd given him the card, they had more than enough reason to suspect he really did know more than he was letting on. It was the night before his wedding, at his bachelor party, that Dan was arrested on charges of fraud. Of course, the charges could only be for fraud because, even though it was clear there was more to the story, there was nothing yet to suggest that Dan had murdered anyone. There wasn't even any evidence to suggest that Sam was dead. Dan knew that too. That's why he used the situation to spin his pre-prepared yarn to investigators about Sam roping him into a credit card fraud scheme by having Dan steal his card, use it to collect repeated sums of money, and then let Sam report it stolen and claim the funds back from his bank. As far as what role Wesley played in the scheme, well, according to Dan, the fact he was a minor made him a perfect person to give the card and the money to for safekeeping, as if he was found with it, he wouldn't be able to be tried as an adult. Yep, it all seemed to make sense on the surface, all except for one remaining question. Why had Sam killed Julie? But Daniel had an answer for that too. The way he explained it, Sam had murdered his friend after a love triangle situation had developed between him, Julie, and Julie's boyfriend, and she had ultimately chosen her boyfriend over him. That was where Sam had actually taken Dan on the day they left his apartment together, and he'd returned a few hours later alone. The reason he didn't tell the police about any of that before was because, after forcing him to help get out of the state, Sam had told Dan that if he spoke a word to anybody about what had truly happened, he'd come back and kill not only him, but Rachel too. While that did seem like a somewhat plausible explanation as to what had happened, when Rachel was brought in to be questioned, her response, or lack of response to the story, was suspicious to say the least. That led to further doubts about the veracity of the story Dan had told detectives. So, apparently realizing the authorities weren't buying what he was selling, Dan decided to just spill the beans altogether later that day. After asking to speak to investigators again, he admitted that he'd not only killed Julie, but he also killed Sam, and that he'd conveniently done it while in a fit of insanity. Though, not surprisingly, that claim of insanity would almost immediately be shown to be pretty thin.
You said you wanted to talk to me. What's going on?
I'm crazy and I did it.
You did what?
I killed Julie and I killed Sam.
Okay. Tell me how you killed Sam.
2 shots using my father's gun that I had.
And your motive behind killing Sam was?
Money and insanity.
Money and insanity. Okay.
He started laughing after admitting to murder in a poor attempt to look like he was mentally ill. Nobody was buying it, though. During his confession, he claimed that, upon realizing how much money Sam had set aside from his days in the military, he saw an opportunity to liberate himself from his financial stresses. All he had to do was get access to his buddy's bank account. He called Sam early on the morning of May 21, 2010, and asked him to help clear out some items from the attic of the Liberty Theater where he was due to be performing that very evening. Being the kind of guy he was, Sam had no problem saying yes, and he headed over. Following a quick stopover at Dan's apartment where the two talked about his money woes, they headed over to the theater located at the military base in Los Alamitos. Of course, once there, all Dan had to do was lure his friend up to the attic and then, when his back was turned, pull out his father's .38 caliber pistol, which he had never sold, and pull the trigger. Much to the surprise of the actor, however, that shot would not be enough to kill Sam. No, at that point he stumbled over and, apparently in shock, shouted out that he'd just been electrocuted. But he hadn't. Once he turned around and saw the gun in Dan's hand, he realized what was really going on, but it was too late. Dan fired another shot, killing Sam. That wasn't the end of the job for Dan, though, as he still had more work to do in order to ensure he didn't get caught. Before he did any of that, though, he took a break to use his friend's ATM card to withdraw some money he would then give to Chris Williams, leave the credit card with Wesley Freilich for safekeeping, then go ahead with his performance at the theater that evening. During the periods he was waiting off stage while his play was going on, he was texting Julie from Sam's phone, asking her to meet up at his apartment later that evening, all while Sam's body was lying dead up in the attic. To say they were the actions of a sick man then would be an understatement. But it wasn't over yet. Once the play was finished, Dan headed over to Sam's apartment and waited for Julie to arrive. When she did, he lured her into the bedroom, claiming that Sam was in there waiting for her, where he pulled out his gun again and shot her once in the head, killing her instantly. Even then, though, there was still work to be done. That included staging Julie's body to make it look as if her murder had been a crime of passion committed by Sam. Then, once that was over, Dan went home to bed, allegedly without his fiance knowing anything had happened. When he woke up the next morning, suitably refreshed, he returned to the attic of the Liberty Theater with a number of tools where he proceeded to cut off Sam's head, hands, and left arm, which had an identifiable tattoo on it. Dan admitted to investigators that he had dumped them in a nearby park. That was exactly where police found them soon after. But while that seemed to close the case on what had happened to Sam and Julie, it almost ended without the killer getting any real punishment for his crimes, as not long after he attempted to commit suicide while in his cell. Thankfully, though, he wouldn't be successful, and so began the long process of prosecuting the murderer. Dan's lawyer would prove to be an expert in dragging things out and delaying them unnecessarily. At least initially, that wasn't a big problem for the authorities, as it gave them plenty of time to figure out where the murder weapon was, and that was in the possession of Dan's brother, Tim Wozniak. Of course, Tim would claim that he hadn't known the weapon had been used to kill anyone when Dan gave it to him. Whether that was true or not, it still made him an accessory to the murder after the fact, which was exactly why he was arrested and charged as such. Due to her strange behavior throughout the whole process, most notably when she appeared to make up an alibi for her fiancé by claiming there was a third party with him and Sam on the day Sam was killed, Rachel was also arrested on suspicion of being an accomplice. Meanwhile, both the Herr and Kibuishi families were able to properly grieve now that they knew exactly what had happened to their children. Julie's parents decided early on to head back over to Japan where, as their cultural traditions stipulated, they spread Julie's ashes on the soil of her motherland. They would return stateside again in time for the beginning of the pretrial hearings in May of 2012, where it was decided that, despite the protests of Dan's lawyer, the death penalty would be sought in the case. But if Dan was worried about that, he was doing a pretty good job of hiding it. In fact, in an interview conducted by the MSNBC series Lockup while he was awaiting trial, he seemed very blasé about the whole situation. The way he presented himself, he somehow wasn't the monster he was being portrayed as in the media, and he was confident the jury would see it that way too. In his own words from that interview, quote, "I just want people to know that, no matter what, throughout all this, I'm a really good guy. Almost everyone in my life will say so." Get the fuck out of here. No matter what people thought about you before you murdered two people in order to steal money, I assure you they don't think that anymore. But then he seemed to be in complete denial about whether he had actually committed the murders he'd already confessed to, instead claiming it was all part of some big misunderstanding. He claimed that he actually felt very fondly of both Sam and Julie. Again, in his own words from that interview, quote, "The two victims were my close friends. Sam lived in the same complex that me and my fiancé lived at. He had helped me out on several occasions. He was there for me, you know. I needed him, and Julie was a friend of the group. Two of the nicest people. Two of the nicest people that I've ever known." When it came to Rachel and the fact that she was estranged from him, Dan only had one thing to say to her, and that was that he wished she was able to see through all of the noise for long enough to take him back. Once more in his own words, quote, "If I was given the opportunity to talk to my fiancé right now, I'd either say, 'Can I be with you out there?' or 'Can you be with me in here?' The bond. I just love her. Like that's the hardest part about getting through my day is just knowing that I can't be with her, period." Clearly, Daniel was either falling into some kind of delusion or was feigning ignorance because he thought it might get him off of a murder charge. Anyone who watched the interview once it aired on television could see that clearly, but that was of little solace to the people who'd been directly affected by the murders. That's not just referring to the Herr and Kibuishi families either. No, it's also referring to the people involved in the Liberty Theater as, on account of all the bad press that was going around about it being the site where Sam was murdered, by an actor who plied his craft there no less, the military officers in charge of the base decided to shut it down. Then there was Wesley Freilich, the 16-year-old boy who'd been roped into the whole plot unknowingly. He now had to contend with the fact that the person he'd idolized had turned out to be a monster who thought so little of him he'd used him as a patsy of sorts. The effect that had on his psyche must have been terrible. Nevertheless, the worst of the grief was saved for Sam and Julie's nearest and dearest, as they were the ones who had ultimately lost a loved one so senselessly. The only thing they could do then was wait and wait as the trial continued to be drawn out, mostly by Dan's lawyer doing everything he could to slow the proceedings down. In fact, so diligent was he about it, on at least one occasion he would approach Steve Herr and indicate to him that that was the way things would continue to go endlessly unless he and the rest of the prosecution agreed to take the death penalty off of the table. But neither Steve nor anyone else on that side of the courtroom had any intentions of doing that. They wanted nothing less than to see Dan pay the ultimate price for his crimes. Two people who wouldn't be paying such a severe price, however, would be Rachel Mae Buffett and Tim Wozniak, Dan's fiancé and brother. The authorities would not be able to find enough evidence to show that either of them were directly involved in the murders, and because there was no murder charge for them, it meant there would be no possibility of the death penalty. Still, though, they could go to prison for a long time as there was enough evidence to charge both with being accessories after the fact, so it wasn't like they were guaranteed to get off scot-free. For Rachel's part, she would continue to protest her innocence, arguing on an episode of Dr. Phil that she was just as much of a victim as anyone else on account of her life being ruined by the actions of her former fiance. But those who knew about the details of the case, specifically about her behavior around the time of the murders, found that difficult to believe. At best, they claimed she had to have known what was going on before Julie died. At worst, she had to have been aware of Dan's plans well ahead of time, with her possibly even being the one who masterminded the whole thing. When it came to Tim, though, there seemed to be no such suspicion on him. While him accepting the murder weapon from his brother after the fact and hiding it certainly did implicate him indirectly, there was no suggestion that he'd been part of the conspiracy to kill Sam and Julie. That was backed up by the way he acted in court when he was brought in for his trial, with him appearing to be genuinely distraught and apologetic toward the families of the deceased. Of course, none of that meant he was going to get off without serving jail time. As his trial went on, that looked increasingly likely, and no matter how much Dan's lawyer tried to delay things, it was looking that way for the actor too. He still had one fan, though. Someone who had been a supporter of his acting work before and who had not only taken to writing him in prison, but also creating a website supporting him to some degree. But the person, who has remained anonymous, was largely criticized for their behavior and was even accused of falling into a cult level of fandom, much like what happened with the Manson girls. Outside of that one supporter, though, pretty much everyone agreed that Dan was guilty and that, if any justice was left in the world, he'd be convicted of the murders of both Sam and Julie. So when the trial finally began in 2016, a full 5 years after he'd first been arrested, everyone was waiting with bated breath to see what the jury would decide. Would they see sense and agree that he needed to at least be locked away for life? That was the question on everyone's mind. In the end, in September of that year, after his own brother testified against him, Daniel Wozniak was convicted on 2 counts of murder in the first degree. Much to the approval of Sam Herr, he was sentenced to death. Yes, now knowing that Dan was going to pay the ultimate price for his crimes, the Herr family as well as the Kibuishi family were finally able to start healing fully. And that's what they continue to do to this day as they await the eventual execution date for their children's killer. As to what became of Rachel Mae Buffett and Tim Wozniak, well, they were both convicted of being accessories to murder, with Rachel being sentenced to 32 months behind bars and Tim being sentenced to 3 years of probation. In November of 2019, Rachel was granted parole and has been released back out into the world. That means if she truly did have more to do with the murders of Sam and Julie, as some people continue to believe, then she might have gotten off easy. A hell of a lot easier than her former fiance. As there has been a moratorium placed on executions in the state of California, Dan may never see a needle, but he surely won't ever see freedom again. Dan thought he was entitled to Sam's money that he had put his life on the line to earn. So killing him in order to steal that money was all the more monstrous. Then he killed another person who had nothing to do with the money just to try and frame his first victim, all while going about his normal life. Because monsters don't see people, they see opportunities. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.